Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going way back to ancient Greece. Going to tackle one of the giants of philosophy, Plato.
Always a good time to revisit Plato.
Yeah. Now, you all sent in some excerpts that focus on Plato's views on poetry. I have to admit, I was a little surprised by what I was reading. I mean, ancient Greece, that's like the birthplace of art and literature, right? But it sounds like Plato wasn't exactly singing poetry's praises.
It's a really interesting contradiction, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this is a society that absolutely loved epic poems, tragic dramas. These were the cornerstones of their culture. And yet, here's one of their most important thinkers sort of questioning the whole thing.
I know. So what's the deal? What was it about poetry that Plato just didn't, I don't know, just didn't like?
Well, to really get into Plato's head, we need to understand a few of the big concepts in his philosophy. And I think a good place to start is with his ideas about poetic inspiration.
Okay, so where do we begin with that?
So Plato believed that poets were divinely inspired, almost like they were channeling something beyond their control, you know?
So not exactly like sitting down and carefully planning out their sonnets, more like just being hit by this wave of creative energy.
Exactly. It wasn't about careful crafting. He describes a poet as this light and winged and holy thing who becomes, and I love this, out of his senses and powerless to utter his oracles unless he's completely gripped by this divine frenzy. And it's interesting, you see these sorts of ideas in other ancient cultures too. This belief that artistic creation comes from somewhere outside the artists themselves.
Oh, that is interesting. But if poetry is born from this, this irrational, almost ecstatic state, does that mean it's kind of unreliable? Like, can we really trust what a poet's saying if they're just a vessel for, as you said, this divine frenzy?
That's the point that Plato's making. If poetry springs from something outside reason and logic, how can it be a source of truth or knowledge?
Okay, yeah, I see what he's getting at. So then that brings us to the next big concept we got to unpack, which is imitation, or as Plato called it, mimesis.
Right. Now, Plato was an idealist. This means he believed that the true reality existed in this realm of perfect ideas. And everything we see and experience in the physical world, well, it's just a copy, an imperfect reflection of those ideal forms. And poetry, he argued, is right there in the thick of it. It's all about imitation.
So he's saying poetry is inherently flawed because it's just reflecting something that's already a copy itself.
Oh, he goes even further than that. Think of a painter creating a portrait, okay? The person they're painting is already a copy of the ideal human form, right? And then the painting is a copy of that copy. So the artwork is twice removed from the true essence.
Whoa, that's a lot of layers. But what makes poetry even further removed from reality than, say, a painting?
Because poetry doesn't just imitate like objects or appearances. It goes deeper. It imitates actions and emotions. And those things, in Plato's view, are themselves imitations of ideal forms. It's like making a copy of a shadow. So poetry isn't just dealing with copies. It's like dealing with copies of copies.
Wow. That's a real demotion for poetry. He's not just critiquing the style or the content, he's like challenging the entire basis of what poetry claims to do.
That's it. He's questioning its very ability to give us any real knowledge or insight because it's so far removed from those ideal forms.
Okay, so we've got this idea that poetry, it comes from this kind of, well, unreliable source, that divine frenzy, and it's also just dealing with copies of things. So how did all of this shape Plato's actual view of poetry? Why was he so worried about it?
Right. So his concerns, they really stemmed from a few different areas. He believed that poetry could be really harmful to society's well-being, that it could mess with our emotions, and that it just didn't have real intellectual value. We can break these down into his moral, emotional, intellectual, and even utilitarian arguments against poetry.
Okay, so let's break it down. Let's start with the moral side of things. How did Plato see poetry as a threat to the ethical fabric of society?
Well, Plato argued that poets, because they're catering to, popular taste, they often focus on what he called pleasant vices. He was worried that showcasing characters who were, doing bad things, it would actually corrupt morals and encourage people to behave badly.
I guess kind of like how today people talk about the negative influence of, I don't know, violent video games or something. Like if you see it enough, it can desensitize you to it in real life.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
Yeah.
But it went beyond just human actions for Plato. He was even more concerned about how the gods and heroes were portrayed in poetry.
Right, because Greek mythology was such a huge part of their culture. What was his problem with how those figures were depicted?
He felt that showing gods and heroes doing immoral things, it undermined their authority. It set a terrible example for everyone else. Remember, this was a society where myths and legends weren't just stories. They were deeply connected to their understanding of the world and their place in it.
So if the gods could get away with anything, why should mortals even bother with rules, right? It sounds like Plato saw poetry as contributing to a kind of moral decline.
Exactly. And this was especially relevant in the context of his time. Plato lived in Athens during a period of decline, of instability. He saw firsthand the effects of political corruption and social unrest, and he saw poetry as perhaps adding fuel to that fire.
So this moral concern, it's tied into his worries about the emotional impact of poetry too, right?
Absolutely. But we can dive into that next.
So we talked about Plato's moral objections to poetry, but what about the emotional side of things? What were his concerns there?
Well, for Plato, poetry, with all its vivid imagery and powerful language, it really appealed to our emotions, often kind of bypassing our rational mind altogether. He was especially worried about how it could stir up really strong feelings, particularly the ones he considered irrational, what he called the spirited emotions.
So he saw this intensity of emotion as a potential problem, both for individuals and for society. It's sort of like how we talk about the dangers of being too influenced by like emotionally charged media today, right?
Yeah, exactly. He worried that poetry could, like, cloud our judgment, make us make decisions based on feelings instead of logic and reason.
Hmm.
Imagine, for instance, a play that really glorifies the idea of revenge. Plato would say that seeing that kind of story over and over again, it might actually make us less sensitive to the consequences of violence.
Hmm.
Maybe even make us more likely to act impulsively ourselves.
But I mean, isn't there something to be said for experiencing those powerful emotions through art? Like, think about the cathartic release you get from watching a tragedy or listening to a piece of music that just tears your heart out.
That's a good point. And it's important to remember that Plato wasn't totally against emotional expression. He actually made an exception for lyrical poetry, which he saw as this genuine outpouring of emotion, not just some kind of calculated imitation. He recognized that humans need to express and process their feelings, but he drew the line when it came to art forms that he felt were manipulating or distorting those emotions.
So it was about the authenticity behind it, the intention. Like he was making a distinction between like a genuine expression and something that's trying to pull your strings.
Exactly. It's a subtle point, but I think it's one that's still really relevant for us today. When we interact with art, it's worth asking ourselves, am I being moved by something real here, or am I just being manipulated?
That's a great point. Okay, so we've got moral concerns, emotional manipulation. What else did Plato find objectionable about poetry?
His third big criticism was intellectual. You remember his idea about imitation, right? How poetry is all about copies of copies. Well, he argued that because of this focus on imitation, poetry actually lacked real knowledge. It wasn't about grasping the true essence of things. It was just about appearances, about superficial representations.
So like it's like describing how beautiful a flower is without understanding the complex biology that makes it, actually grow. You might capture the beauty on the surface, but you're missing the deeper understanding.
Exactly. And for Plato, this lack of true knowledge, it made poetry completely unreliable as a source of information. He even said it was thrice removed from reality, even further than painting, because it imitates actions and emotions, which are themselves already imitations.
So if poetry couldn't offer real knowledge, what good was it in Plato's view? Did he think it should just be, I don't know, banned outright?
Well, that brings us to his last criticism, the utilitarian one. Plato imagined this ideal society, and it was really focused on practical skills, the kind of knowledge you needed for good government and being a good citizen. And in that kind of society, he argued, poetry just didn't have a place. It didn't serve any real purpose.
So if it wasn't directly useful to the state, it was just a distraction. But isn't that kind of a narrow view of art? I mean, don't things like beauty and emotional expression have value, even if they aren't, like, practically useful?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries, right? Where do we draw the line between art for art's sake and art that's meant to serve a purpose?
Hmm.
Plato was definitely on the utilitarian side of things. But even back then, people were pushing back against that idea.
And speaking of pushing back, that brings us to another big name in this whole debate, Aristotle. He was Plato's student, but he had a very different perspective on poetry.
Right, Aristotle really challenged a lot of his teacher's assumptions. You see, while Plato kind of distrusted the physical world and the senses, he saw them as distractions from the true reality of those perfect forms we talked about. Aristotle believed that we learn by studying the world around us.
So while Plato was looking up at the sky, searching for those ideal forms, Aristotle was looking around at the world as it actually was.
Exactly. And this really fundamental difference in their philosophies had a huge impact on how they thought about poetry. For Plato, with his focus on those perfect ideals, poetry was just this pale imitation, maybe even leading us away from the truth.
But for Aristotle, poetry wasn't about just copying reality, right? It was about transforming it, about revealing deeper truth through that process of creative imitation. He saw value in the emotional experience, the catharsis, the way poetry lets us explore what it means to be human.
Absolutely. And this is where things get really fascinating. Aristotle actually said that poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history because it deals with these universal truths and possibilities, not just a record of specific events.
So while Plato saw poetry as like 3 steps removed from reality, Aristotle thought it was a way to get closer to the heart of the human experience, to explore those big questions about life and morality and our place in the universe.
Exactly. He saw poetry as a tool for understanding ourselves and the world, not just some frivolous pastime.
What an interesting contrast. So you've got Plato, the idealist, worried about how poetry might lead us astray, and then you've got Aristotle, the pragmatist, who embraces its potential to shed light on things. It's like they were looking at the same thing from completely different angles.
In that multifaceted approach, that's what we should be taking away from this, I think. There's no one right answer when it comes to interpreting and evaluating art. Both Plato and Aristotle had valuable insights that have helped us understand art's complexity.
It's crazy to think that these arguments about art, about its purpose and its influence, we're still having them today, thousands of years later. We've looked at Plato's concerns and we've explored Aristotle's counterpoints, and it just makes me wonder how these philosophers would see our world now. I mean, it's a world that's just saturated with media, right?
It is a fascinating question, isn't it? I mean, would Plato even look at things like movies or TV shows or video games and just see them as dangerous imitations? Or, would he maybe see something valuable in the way they explore complex ideas and how they connect with us emotionally?
I'm just picturing Plato watching like a reality TV show. I bet he'd be totally confused by the fact that people would choose to put their lives out there like that, for everyone to see.
I know. And can you imagine him trying to wrap his head around the idea of spending hours and hours in a virtual world? That's his whole copy of a copy of a copy problem taken to a whole new level.
Right. But there's a part of me that thinks he might also be kind of drawn in by the creative possibilities of it all. Like, imagine Plato watching a movie like The Matrix, right? A story that's all about the nature of reality. I think he might actually dig that.
Yeah, I bet he'd be really interested in how modern storytelling can bring together philosophy and entertainment and technology in ways that he probably couldn't even dream of. He might even see connection between the immersive power of, ancient Greek theater and the way virtual reality can kind of transport us to these different worlds.
It's a really cool thought experiment. How would someone who is so suspicious of imitation react to a world where so much of what we experience is coming through screens and simulations?
I don't know if we can really say for sure,
Mm.
but maybe instead of trying to figure out exactly what he'd think, we can use his ideas as a way to look at our own relationship with media.
So even if we don't completely agree with everything Plato said, what can we still learn from him?
Well, I think his main point was all about being aware, being critical. He wanted us to question the messages we're taking in, to recognize that there's always the potential for manipulation, and to be really careful about what we choose to engage with.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even the most entertaining stories, the movies with the most amazing special effects, they can all be carrying certain ideologies and values and agendas, and those might not line up with our own.
Right, and it's not about rejecting all forms of entertainment or being super cynical about everything. It's more about engaging with them thoughtfully, asking questions, and being aware of how they might be affecting our thoughts and feelings and actions.
So in a way, Plato's critiques of poetry, they give us this framework for navigating the really complex media landscape we have today. It's all about being conscious consumers, recognizing the power of storytelling, and choosing the stories that make our lives better, not just the ones that distract us.
That's a great way to put it. It's about approaching all forms of art and media with that same critical mindset that Plato brought to the poetry of his time.
Well, that about wraps it up for our deep dive into Plato and poetry. We might have started in ancient Greece, but those ideas have brought us right up to the present day, haven't they?
Definitely. Hopefully this conversation gave you some new things to think about and encouraged you to look a little closer at the stories and images that shape your own view of the world.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming along with us on this journey. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.